Thank you, John, and thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. And I'd really like to start by congratulating PWB for, first of all, this seminar, which I think the topic is fascinating, but also for reaching out and recognizing that this isn't just an issue that affects the global north, and often populism is seen as in a very kind of Eurocentric or North American way, but the largest democracies in the world, or some of the largest democracies of the world in the global south, India, Brazil, Turkey, also have hard right populist leaders. And when you add their numbers to the countries living under authoritarian systems or dictatorships, it's clearly that populism or hard right governance is a problem, is a global problem, and needs to be addressed on a global basis. So I'm very pleased that PWB is addressing this topic and also addressing this topic in this particular way. I've lots to say about populism and how to combat it, but I realize with quite limited time, I should probably concentrate on the situation in Brazil, because I think I probably need to explain a little bit about what's actually happening here. And I'd obviously then be very happy to respond to questions and about ways forward. Brazil probably has the worst populist president in any democracy now, since Trump, but including Trump. I mean, for all Trump's problems, he at least wasn't that anti-vaccine, which Bolsonaro is. I mean, as well as flouting social distancing and the restrictions to prevent the spread of COVID, Bolsonaro has spent the last year undermining potential vaccination programs. He spent almost all of the budget that he had on, that he could have bought vaccines with, buying chloroquine, and he has warned people that having the vaccine might turn them into crocodiles. And he has continually attempted by his own actions, he's gone out embracing people, doing walkabouts, undermining restrictions by state authorities to curtail populations, embracing people even when he was diagnosed as having COVID himself. He calls COVID a little cold and says Brazilians have to kind of man up and be more macho about it. And the consequences of this were predicted and are predictable. 60,000 people died of COVID in Brazil last month. 100,000 are predicted to die this month. The virus is mutating rapidly. Increasing numbers of the people that are being brought in and put on ventilators are in their 20s and 30s. We know that a new strain is incubating in Brazil that will potentially then spread around the world. And so, given that with the UK and the US aside, most countries have not yet succeeded in vaccinating the majority of their adult population, Brazil is going to bounce COVID back into the rest of the world as a direct consequence of Bolsonaro's policies and attitudes. To kind of contextualize that, which I suppose I need to, when talking about Latin America, there are lots of obvious things to say about it, but two things stand out. One, in terms of the politics, one is Latin America has always been seen, well, until recently, was seen as in the United States' backyard. So domestic politics in most Latin American countries tend to be defined, at least to some extent, well, and certainly historically, as being pro or anti the US. And secondly, Latin America suffered a series of military coups sponsored by the United States. Brazil was under military dictatorship between 1964 and 1984, and slowly opened to democracy during the 1980s. The campaign to restore democracy in Brazil was led by the left. The main political party associated with it was the Workers' Party, Partido Trabalhista, Partido dos Trabalhadores in Portuguese, led by Lula. And PT was essentially an alliance of trade unionists, Catholics, liberation theologian Catholics. Brazil was at the heart of liberation theology, and ex-guerrillas. Many of the leading activists in PT were guerrillas in the 1960s against dictatorship. Many were imprisoned and tortured, including Dilma Rousseff, who subsequently became president of Brazil. Politically, I think the PT are probably, to locate it domestically, Corbynistas, in as much as they're social democrat, basically, but clearly to the left of where I would most be comfortably situated as a kind of broadly social democrat, progressive, left of centre person. But I think in the context of Latin America, you can see why that's the case, and particularly US military involvement in destabilizing democracy. And Lula was elected in 2003, the year that I moved to Brazil, on a wave essentially, and in a program essentially very similar to Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. I mean, he agreed that he would abide essentially by the economic policies of his predecessor. He would use, he didn't even raise taxation significantly. He would use social democratic reform to raise the minimum wage, introduce anti-poverty measures like Bolsa Familia, the first cash transfer program, strengthen trade union rights, expand higher education, implement quotas to make higher education more accessible, and essentially improve health, improve education. So it was a kind of a minimalist reform program, which was very successful. Between 2003 and 2013, Brazil's economy grew rapidly. Brazil became less unequal, not much, but a bit. Poverty decreased dramatically. Education opportunities also increased. John's already plugged my book, but if anyone would like a copy, which we're very happy to give you as a participant in the seminar, President Dilma has a chapter which outlines the achievements of PT in government, and they were impressive, but they were also social democrat. I mean, compared to, say, Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua, Brazil did not go in that leftist direction. Brazil was the Brazilian left was much more mainstream social democrat. Brazil, or PT, was also a clean hands party. It won power partly because it promised to combat corruption, and it did much, to be fair to it. It strengthened the direct public prosecutors, it strengthened the police, it invested in anti-crime programs, penal reform, and so on. Crime did go down, although at dramatically high levels, and corruption was to some extent combated. However, and this was the huge conundrum, Brazil had faced two problems, or faced one big problem, that it's a multi-party democracy. I mean, if you look at the Brazilian Congress, I don't know how many parties are in, 20 or 30. I mean, it makes the Israeli Knesset look stable. And most of the political parties are not particularly ideologically motivated. There's something called the Big Centre, or the Centron, who dominate the Congress. And basically, their votes are almost for sale. So to stitch together a parliamentary majority, you have to do deals. I mean, that's just an inescapable fact of life about Brazilian politics. And PT faced two problems. The first was called the Mensalão, the big monthlies, in 2005, when it emerged that senior figures in the Workers' Party, PT, had been bribing opposition politicians to vote for the government on specific acts, progressive acts, but they were bribed. PT lost most of its leadership as a result of that. Its chief of staff was forced to resign, its treasurer was sacked, various people were expelled, and the party continued. It was re-elected under twice with Lula, and then twice with Dilma Rousseff. And when Lula left power in 2008, he had 87% record popularity. Barack Obama said, you know, this guy, he's the man, he's the most popular politician in the world. Because basically Brazilians were prepared to tolerate a certain amount of corruption in return for progressive social reform. Then in 2014, economic crisis hit under President Dilma. Living standards collapsed, unemployment rocketed, inflation went up, then went down, there was an austerity program implemented. And at the same time, an anti-corruption probe uncovered a new wave of corruption, which was much bigger quantitatively than the previous. PT had basically done deals with minor political parties, given them ministries in return for their support. And those politicians had basically looted the treasury to a massive extent, using kickbacks from state-owned agencies, particularly the oil industry. They'd enrich themselves and they'd enrich their parties. PT had probably benefited from that, and some PT politicians had probably personally benefited from that, although there's no evidence that Lula had in any way personally benefited for it. His grandson or his granddaughter died in hospital a couple of years ago. She was in a state hospital with no access to private medical care. Lula continues to live in a very modest flat in a modest area of Sao Paulo. There's no evidence he personally enriched himself. But this combination of they were in government, the economy was in crisis, and politicians associated with the government were looting the coffers, enraged Brazilians. They felt, and I understand exactly why, we are poor because the politicians are rich. Lula or the PT are in power, they're doing it. This was exacerbated by essentially a politically motivated corruption probe led by a judge, Sergio Moro, who subsequently became the first Minister for Justice in Bolsonaro's government, who was clearly right-wing and clearly politically motivated, and attempted to establish that Lula was personally directing this web, a conspiracy of corruption. He has subsequently been exposed as having colluded with the prosecution, having deliberately leaked evidence to the press, having perverted the course of justice. He's now himself under investigation. Lula was imprisoned, but all charges against him have been quashed. He is now free to contest the next presidential election, and all the signs show, all the opinion polls show, he will win it. Bolsonaro's government continues to suffer crisis. Bolsonaro kind of identified himself as an outsider. He won power because he was seen as not part of the elite. And the elite, both the centrists and PT, were seen as corrupt. He was just not part of that political tradition. And so people liked him because of that. Although there's very clear evidence that his family are very closely linked to the militia, are involved in extortion in Rio de Janeiro, were personally involved in the murder of Marielle Franco, left politician in Rio, and have also clearly benefited from personal kickbacks. Bolsonaro's son recently bought a mansion in Brasilia, which he couldn't have done on a politician's salary. So, but at the time when Bolsonaro was able to cast himself as an outsider and also as the most anti-PT politician in Brazil, Dilma was impeached, again on extremely dubious constitutional grounds, and in casting his vote for her impeachment, Bolsonaro said he was doing it in memory of the military officer who, under the dictatorship, had imprisoned and tortured her. I mean, this revolted many people, but it identified him to this very large anti-PT bloc as the ultimate anti-Petista. The centrist bloc collapsed, and Bolsonaro basically hoovered up the anti-PT vote. I don't want to run over time. I could talk for far longer about this, but I'm happy to open it up to questions. But the situation now is Bolsonaro has essentially had to reorientate his political position to the big center. He's shed some of his more extreme, essentially crazy supporters. There's no other way to describe his ex-foreign minister other than a paranoid lunatic, and some other politicians who are clearly on the hard right. Last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, he sacked the Ministry of Defense, and in response, the three leading generals of the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army all resigned in protest. It's possible he's trying to, or he clearly supported what happened on January the 6th in the United States, and he's clearly said he will do the same if he loses the popular vote. The extent to which he can do that, I think, is debatable, because although, as I said, Brazil has been under military dictatorship, we've also had 20, 30 years of democracy, and there is a democratic culture in Brazil. And most Brazilians want what all of us want. We want clean government, we want competency, we want transparency, and we want progressive social reform. So my view is that's what we do. I think the same as Alison. We mobilize the progressive majority against the extremists and the conspiracy theorists and the truth deniers. Apologies if I went over, but thanks, John.